Oh, shoot. It's 1 o'clock already, and I'm still eating my lunch. But right now, what we're actually going to do is some nature journaling basics. Are you ready? All right, so we're going to start off with nature journaling index. Well, nature journaling indexes are really important and they actually can look really cool. In fact, that's not what we're going to be doing today. But nature journaling indexes can be way cooler than you might think. Ta-da! You've probably seen some of my videos before where I have shown you my indexing process, but that's not what we're going to do today. We're going to do some other nature journaling basics. Nope, not indexing. Dun, dun, dun. We are going to do I notice, I wonder, it reminds me of. Yay! So, I notice, I wonder, it reminds me of is one of the most basic and most essential nature journaling techniques. And even though it's one of the most basic, it's still one of the most important, and I keep coming back to it. So today we can do I notice, I wonder, it reminds me of together, looking at this. That food is really stuck in my teeth. Okay, this is going to be our I notice, I wonder, it reminds me of subject. And first, what we do is just noticing, so making observations about what we're looking at. So that's different from bringing in outside information or interpretations or theories or things we've memorized or names of things. So it's just about like the shapes, for example. So I'll go and start by example saying something that I noticed, which is that I noticed this large shape over here on this side, large dark thing coming off, and I don't notice one on this side. I notice for the most part, other than that, I notice a bilateral symmetry. So this object has a very similar appearance on this side and on this side. And if I drew a line down the middle here, it would be symmetrical. I mean, there's a couple things that are off. Oh, and now I'm noticing that in addition to this only being on one side, there's also this other thing over here that I'm only seeing on one side. So let's take a moment now. For those of you who are watching live, or for those of you who watch this as a recorded version, let's take a moment now and write down some of the things that we notice. So your direct observations, it could be about colors, it could be about shapes, it could be about symmetry or lack thereof. All of those things are direct observations. An indirect thing here that doesn't count for I notice would be to say that say like the species name of what you think this is, or start interpreting it in that way. So let's take a moment to write down some things that we notice. And you can also do a sketch when you practice I notice. All right, great. So another thing that you can do when you practice I notice is you can go around in circles with other people and hear what other people see. It's a really great practice, even for people who don't read and write. So for example, sometimes for kids, you can also look at things from different sides. So let's flip it over and maybe do the same exercise again from this side. What do you notice? You could also notice relative size. So I'm using a pencil here, which gives you relative size. I just noticed something on this that I've never noticed before. And I've looked at this thing quite a bit, but I just noticed these two shapes here. There's one here on this side, one on that side, and one on that side. I had never noticed those before. So if you, oh, I'm also noticing this. I didn't notice this either. Okay, so here's another thing that's different on one side than the other. There's this long skinny thing. It's more of a red color and it's lighter than the dark thing it's on top of, the dark fat thing, but I don't see one on this side. So there's 1, 2, 3 things over here that I don't see over there. And based on the sort of, other than that, the bilateral symmetry, I would be curious about that. And that curiosity is exactly how you get to your questions. So some of you might have been learning that in nature journaling, asking tons of questions is considered really cool. And there's a lot of reasons why asking questions is really useful and really powerful. And I've talked about that in other videos. But if you're just trying to get better at asking questions, you might sometimes have this feeling like you don't have any questions. In which case, starting with I notice is always going to help, because I notice will provide the observations that will be the foundation of your questions. So I, for example, am starting to become very curious about this symmetry thing, that this thing that I'm looking at is symmetrical on both sides for the most part, but there's like three major weird things up here that I only see on one side and not at all on the other. So that could lead to questions. So the next stage would be I wonder, and that's the stage where we write down some questions. So go ahead and write down some of your questions. Whether you're watching this with me live today, welcome, or if you're watching this as a recording, let's take a moment now. This is your chance to practice, okay? So let's not just be more consumers of creative content. Let's be engaged and creating along and being constructive together. So let's write down some questions that we have about this thing that we're seeing here. All right, great. So I've been talking too much. I've hardly written down any of my own questions. Okay, and then the last is it reminds me of. And it reminds me of, you can bring in the outside information. So things that you might know, for example, about marine biology in this case. But it's really cool to start off the I notice, especially, and the I wonder from a place of not knowing. So even if you knew all along that this was a crab, or you think that you have a strong feeling that this is a crab, starting from the beginning with the idea that you don't know that this is even an animal helps you notice things in a very direct way that's very powerful and is very objective, compared to if we go in and we immediately, before we start writing down our observations, we immediately identify this as a crab. What if we're wrong? What is a crab anyways? I'm not a marine biologist or an expert in crustaceans, but I think it would be really interesting to actually, have maybe a more specific definition of that term before we start calling something a crab. And I have a feeling there's other things that could have similar structures and all that. But now at this point, it reminds me of is when you can bring in your outside information. So if you do have, this does remind you of a crab, the claw reminds you of a nutcracker. Those are the kinds of things that you write down and it reminds me of. And remember, this part of nature journaling, you can do it verbally. So you can do this with people who don't read or write, and it's a really great practice. So go ahead and write down at least 2 things that this reminds you of. Okay, great. So it reminds me of, I think, is the one that's slightly less important. There's definitely a lot of benefits to connecting things with things you already know or remember. There's a lot of benefits for your brain and your learning. But the I notice and the I wonder, I think, are the really, really powerful parts of this. So as you can see, I did not write down very many myself because my goal today is to help you practice. And part of doing that is me explaining a few things. You can always pause the video if you need me to be quiet for a little bit, and getting things all set up to make sure that you can get the most quality learning experience and actually do some nature journaling yourself during this time together. Whoa, zoom in there. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a quick sketch. So imagine I have a bunch of writing here with all my questions. Fill in your questions. Now I'm going to do a quick sketch, and I'm not even going to worry too much about what it ends up looking like. Because remember, in nature journaling, drawing is a tool for thinking and a tool for learning. It's not just a decoration for the wall. So I used to call this part of the crab the diaper, but then someone recently told me it's technically called the apron. And I thought, okay, that doesn't even sound more technical. It's still referring to a human clothing item. So that's an example of it reminds me of is some scientists decided this reminded them of an apron. And so now it's actually called the apron in science. And I used to call it the diaper, and someone corrected me and said it's called the apron, but I actually feel like diaper is a better, if you're going to call part of a crab by a human garment name, then I think diaper makes more sense for this instead of apron. But, okay, so I'm noticing myself getting too focused on the details here. So I'm actually going to start completely different drawing here where I'm just going to focus on this kind of bigger shape and not even distinguish between the individual legs at first. Okay, and then coming over here, this one's kind of going that way. It's kind of a complicated creature, so it's easy to get overwhelmed and stuck in the details, but I'm gonna try not to do that. Okay, so this leg's coming forward. I'm getting stuck in the details and running into my other overlap one. Okay, so when this starts happening and you're not liking your drawing, just keep going. So now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna just focus on to sort of mix it up a little bit. I'm gonna focus on just the claw. There could be things about drawing this crab that are just challenging due to the subject matter. And if I start letting that get to my head too early on, then that could be very take the motivation out of my entire nature journaling outing, for example, or session. So sometimes just switching to another part. And then if that still is sort of not working or you're not really happy with that, another thing you could do is use words. So like right now, for some reason, this doesn't come out looking or reading as a claw to me. So what I'm going to do, and you can do this too, is use words. Claw. How easy was that? The other thing that I can do is I can vent about how this is going for me, such as, why is this drawing hard? So even just by doing that, it kind of moves me a little bit more, removes me one step from the sort of emotional feelings or identifying with the drawing. And what you'll find is through nature journaling, you can de-romanticize the art part, and you can actually end up getting better at the art part by coming at it from these sort of different perspectives and thinking about it as a tool. So now I'm going to change scale. That's another thing you can do. If you're feeling stuck, I'm going to change scale and do a much bigger version of this claw, and also looking at it from a different perspective. It's really easy to start off and try to just do one big drawing of a subject and end up failing or having a drawing that doesn't look very great or that you're not happy with. But by jumping around a lot more and doing a lot of different sketches, I think it's easier to keep going, and you're not going to come to the false conclusion that, oh, I just can't draw crabs. Well, how many times have you drawn a crab? If you haven't drawn one or even looked at this species of crab, if you've never even looked at this species before, how can you expect that you're on the first try going to be good at drawing it? But we come up with these rationalizations, and then we might decide, okay, I just draw flowers and I don't draw anything else. That's fine, but I think it's just important for us to be really self-aware about what the process behind our decision making is. And if it's just, we're just trying to be comfortable with something, or we actually want to learn about new things and get better and kind of understand our own blind spots. Okay, so now I'm going to somehow maybe circle this, and I'll write claw again, from above, and I'll do claw like. So basically, I should have kept track of how long this was taking me. But basically, I would say I started with a really bad drawing. Abandoned that drawing partway through, didn't give myself enough space, started a second drawing of the whole, trying to draw this whole complex thing. That drawing also came out pretty bad. So then I jumped to a zoomed in drawing of the claw from underneath, started to draw that. I added this black, which I think kind of threw off the ability to read this as a claw. So then I abandoned that and tried another claw, and then I did another claw from above. I used some writing, some venting, and I made a box around this bigger claw. So I changed perspective and I changed size, zoomed in there, and then I did bubble letters, and that's about it. But what you can see is I literally, and then this next to, I notice, I wonder it reminds me of, I'll fill in these questions, and basically right there on 1/4 of a page, 1/4 of my page, in about 15 or 20 minutes, I did a legit nature journaling session, and it actually has an okay aesthetic to it now. It started off with pretty bad drawings, and none of them by themselves are good drawings at all. But combined with the words and the little box, it actually comes out to having some aesthetic value, in my opinion. Your opinion might differ, and that's totally fine. I'm not going to say it's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen in my life, but I'll take it. I will absolutely take that and run with it and be happy for the rest of my nature journaling session because I started with that. So now I'm just going to quickly write in a couple I notices and discuss them. So I'm going to show you how to make these short, which will help you in the field. So don't worry about complete sentences and don't worry about spelling while you're nature journaling. So I'm going to say bilateral symmetry. That's something that I noticed. It's not bringing in like outside information that I've memorized or been taught. Bilateral symmetry, varying color. I'm going to write mostly after bilateral symmetry because some of it seems to be missing. Varying color, purple hues. Okay, I wonder what is missing. I probably could have just written missing question mark. Oh, but I should show that on the crab. That would be an important thing to show on my crab. What is missing? What else could I ask? I'm mostly curious about that. How one side, or how come just one side? Species, question mark. That's an example of a one-word question. There's lots of these. Age, edibility, question mark. So I remember when I used to play Scrabble, I thought the whole point was to use cool long words. And then I sort of got tired of and disenchanted with Scrabble when I realized that the people who are really good at Scrabble just know all of these 3-letter words that are never ever used in language normally. And I was kind of like, that's lame. It's all about just knowing 3-letter words with lots of like X's and Y's that nobody knows. So how does this connect to nature journaling? Well, one way it connects to nature journaling is that if you start to learn all of these 1-letter questions, it really helps with I wonder when you're nature journaling, because you can just write species, age, edibility. And look, I got 3 questions, and the person next to me might be writing out like a really long sentence with proper punctuation, and I just beat them with 3 questions. Just kidding, nature journaling is not really supposed to be competitive in that way, but it is cool to know how to ask questions with just one word. So see if you can think of any one-word questions. So in a minute, we're going to get into some. So for example, you might say this is dead, right? Um, and you might say that in I notice, but I highly recommend that when you do I notice, you don't say that something is dead, because I'm going to trick you really soon. And a lot of things in nature you think are dead, and you think that that's like a really clear objective observation. But what you should actually probably say is what you actually see. You don't see death. So just a little hint here. It's sort of, there's a lot of things that are like the air or gases. They're invisible. We see other things that are affected by them, for example, or it's just a concept. But if you said, I noticed that it is dead, I would argue that that's incorrect. So what tells you that it might be dead? It's not moving, or it's dry, or it's broken, or it looks like it has damage to it. Those are kinds of things that might tell you that something is dead. But just be aware that that is not an I notice. You could say it reminds me of a dead crab that I saw, or something like that. It reminds me of dead crab, robot. So for it reminds me of, I recommend at least 2 things. One of them should be what you actually think this is. Oh, and I think they're called porcelain. I think I looked it up, and it's called a porcelain crab. I could write porcelain crab I saw on iNaturalist. iNaturalist, by the way, is an app that helps you identify things in nature so that you don't have to post all of those photos on the Nature Journal Club Facebook page, because there's actually other pages for that. I mean, that's cool if you do it too, but that's not what that club is for. But iNaturalist is a great way to post photos of things like this and try to identify them, the species. So you can see that's all I'm doing for it. It reminds me of, and basically what you got there is a 20-minute nature journaling session that has pretty much all of the great elements of nature journaling. I didn't do metadata up here. I probably should have, but I'm nature journaling at home, so it's not as big of a deal. But that's how you do a basic I noticed, I wonder, it reminds me of. And now we're going to do some more, because I have a bunch of cool other things that I want to show you to do. I notice, I wonder, it reminds me of. I'm going to check out the comments. Thanks for people who are joining in live. If you're just joining in at home in the recorded version, that's cool. You can participate too. The whole idea here is that this is an opportunity for all of us to practice nature journaling, not just to watch other people nature journal. So I'm going to look who's here. Valerie's here. Thanks, Valerie. Good to see you. Cindy is here. Yes, Cindy, great questions. This is indeed my favorite drawing pin. If you look up best brush pins for nature journaling, I've done reviews of these, and I compare them to their closest competitors and most similar products, in my opinion. So you can check out those reviews. I do highly recommend these. These are pretty much my favorite drawing tool right now. Absolutely love them, and you can do watercolor over them. Let me show you some examples. I love watercolor over them. I do watercolor over the gray and over the black. The gray is a little bit more water soluble, but they're both technically waterproof. Let's see here. I have a lot of notes recently, so okay, this is watercolor over the black ink right there. So you can see the ink didn't run at all. Black Pilot Fudayaku with the watercolor on top. And then you can see here I use the gray for all the writing. So up here in the lettering would be an example of the gray combined with watercolor on top of it. And you can see the gray got paler in a couple places. So it will lift the gray up a little bit. But I find that actually really cool for landscapes because you can draw the landscape, sketch the landscape shapes with the gray side, and then you can watercolor on top and really focus on getting the values with the watercolor. And a lot of people will look at it and think that you just did straight watercolor, which is great. Cool. Thanks for sharing all of that information. And okay, so what we're going to do next is look at some other images and things from nature before I go back to the other camera. So I'm going to share my screen now and get ready. We're going to do some more nature journaling together right now. So here we go. Okay, so let's start with I notice. Go ahead and write down some of the things that you notice here. What do you notice? Remember, you can notice quantities or patterns of quantities. You can notice differences between light and dark. Very important information comes there. There's a couple tricks in here, and I'm gonna be really hard with this one. I'm not gonna let you get away with any assumptions at all. So try to just focus on what you're actually observing. All right, great. So some of the things that I notice, all right, looks like I'm not gonna be able to see the comments while sharing this at the same time. Some of the things that I notice is it really dark in the middle. Definitely not bilateral symmetry. So the last thing we were looking at had that symmetry where you could draw a line down the middle and it would be the same on both sides. It could have that, but this is more of what's called radial symmetry. So if you sliced it up like a pie, you could get all of those pie slices to look the same. You could not do that with the crab. The crab did not have radial symmetry. So the fact that this has radial symmetry is really interesting because radial symmetry is only in a few kinds of animals, but we see it more in other things that aren't animals. So that could lead us to something that right now would be assumption, but let's just focus on things that we notice. I noticed lots of long, skinny things coming out from the middle dark area. I noticed a couple different kinds of things that seem to be coming out of the dark middle area. I noticed, and here's where I'm going to bust myself. I noticed that it's wet. So if I say I noticed that it's wet, I'm not actually touching this thing. And even if I were touching it, there's some things that could trick my senses. But what are my senses telling me that this is wet? Because it's possible you might have seen some things that can look like this or can look like they're wet, but they're not. And if you can't think of anything like that, think about certain types of paint, for example, that have a shiny surface, or ways that photographers can create or what about ice or plastic, little clear plastic droplets? Could you make little clear plastic droplets that look like that? Or are there plants that have things on them like crystals that look just like that? In fact, there's quite a few things that could look like that. It's probably a fair assumption, but let's focus on what you actually see. So let's see. I noticed these little round things sort of evenly spread out and slightly varying in size, but none of them are over a certain size. They seem pretty small and they seem to reflect light in a way that makes them seem spherical, and they remind me of water, and I wonder if they're water. So that's just a very nuts and bolts going in depth into how to do I notice, I wonder, it reminds me of on something like this. But let's go ahead and skip to questions. And some things that I wonder about this is, I wonder if this is from a plant. I wonder if this is a flower. I wonder which reproductive parts those are, if they are reproductive parts. I'm assuming they are reproductive parts because that's usually the business that flowers are in. I wonder what that yellow stuff is. I wonder if that yellow stuff is pollen. And you can see how you can phrase your thoughts or predictions or interpretations as questions. So I could, for example, say, I wonder if, like, if I think that that is pollen, I'm pretty sure it's pollen, I can say, I wonder if that's pollen, instead of just saying that is pollen. So those are some of the kind of nitty gritty things about how to do I wonder when you're doing I notice, I wonder, it reminds me of. And I start to bring in some more of the assumptions. So it's like, okay, to say that this is a plant at this point, or to assume it's a plant so far. All right, great. So go ahead and write down a couple things that it reminds you of. And this is where you can bring out outside information. It reminds me of the cactus flower in my grandma's garden. Or a silly it reminds me of. Like, it reminds me of a starfish. Maybe that's not a silly one. It reminds me of basmati rice with like cheese grated on it, that part in the middle. So those are all examples of it reminds me of. And those are the three most important, absolutely most important things for nature journaling. I noticed, I wonder, it reminds me of. And now we're going to do another one here, looking at something on the table. Yeah, spaghetti. I could totally see that, Valerie. All right, so we're going to go back to the table here. Whoops, that's my lunch. Never mind, not that. No, we're going to look at this here. Okay, so let's start with I notice. What do you notice? Go ahead and write down things that you notice. Let's start off assuming we don't know it's a plant. So I notice that it has long things coming out from the middle that get pointier towards the tip. I notice that each one of those long things looks like it has little tips on the sides. I notice that those long things are kind of wavy. I notice that it's darker in the center. I notice specks of white. I notice some of the tips are sort of yellow. I notice that there's 1, 2, 3, that there's 8 of them, and then one really little one in the middle. Those are some examples of things that I noticed. And let's skip into I wonder. Go ahead and write down some questions that you have about it. All right, great. Now, what does it remind you of? It reminds me of a bromeliad. Okay, so this is one where I was trying to trick people because my question is for you right now, is this plant alive? That's my question. Is that plant alive? Let's write that down as one of our I wonders. That would be an example of what some people might consider a silly question, same as it could have been, with this? If I asked on my Nature Journal page, is this crab alive? People might be like, that's silly. Of course it's not alive. But what about this? Okay, so I'm going to do a quick sketch while you're thinking about that trippy concept. Okay, and then I'm going to write my question, my focus question. Now I'm going to go from that question and show you how one question that might be kind of silly could lead to some more interesting ones. So like, for example, is dead different in plants and animals? So this is an example too that I want you to think about, because how many times has a little kid asked you a question like this? Like looking at, maybe looking at something like this, or looking at something like this that maybe we might take this question for granted. How many times has a little kid, oh, I should have made their arm pointing out. Not the best drawing of a little kid I've ever done. So how often do little kids ask questions like this, and then someone just gives them an answer? An adult just gives them an answer, usually a bad one, or tells them that's a silly question, or somehow doesn't really value this question. But how about if we as adults, oh, my neighbor's driving by, that's why it's loud. How about if we as adults actually think about that question and then maybe respond with another question or a clarifying question, or even just say, wow, that's a good question. What is alive? So I'll write that over here. That would be another way that this could lead to. And this is sort of like a curiosity chain is what Fiona was calling it at Wild Wonder when she was talking to John Muir Laws, I think on the second night. Is a curiosity chain. I think that's what she was calling it. Is it alive? What is definition of alive? Okay, so in this case, this plant right here, some of these this isn't an air plant, but bromeliads are also air plants, and many people might know that air plants at least can live with basically no roots. Their roots don't really do anything. However, this one, I think it uses its roots a little bit more, but bromeliads in general don't use their roots for very much as far as like water and nutrient conducting go compared to a lot of other plants. However, this one, I think that it might be dying. I think it doesn't have enough of this bottom part here to continue growing. So it's basically like a cut off piece of the original plant. But here, this will make it even more extreme is this part of the plant right here is this dead? I mean, it's separated from the plant, but is it dead, or at what point will this be dead? So you could probably in like a tissue culture lab get this to grow from just that part. If I were really careful, I could probably, as a gardener, get this part to grow. But in a petri dish, you could probably get this part to grow and start a new plant from that. So does that count as being dead if you can still bring it back? But what about this? Like, would it be possible to bring back this dead crab? I don't know. So it's kind of anyways, an interesting question to at least use our nature journals to play around with that one a little bit. Okay, I'm going to go back to my photo stream because I still have some really cool photos that I want to show you. So let's do that. Okay, so this is really similar to the last one, so I think I'm going to skip it. There's my pages from Nature Journaling That Flower. That's a very rare flower, by the way. Thanks to Eli for taking me out there. Ooh, that was a fun page. Okay, let's do I Notice, I Wonder, It Reminds Me Of with this. So starting with I Notice and pretending like we don't even know what this is at all. What shapes do you notice and can you count them? You can also just do a drawing for I Notice. Sometimes I do it that way. What do you see directly? And if you were in person and you could touch this, you would get other sensory information. Because right now we're basically only using our visual senses for our I Notice. And sometimes this exercise, the I Notice part, and pretending like we don't know anything about whether it's a plant or an animal or a mineral, a fungus, a symbiotic relationship between a fungus and a plant. We don't know. It could be a human-made structure. We pretend like we don't know any of that. And it might feel kind of kindergarten, but I'm telling you, it's a really powerful practice. And the more you get comfortable doing this, the more objective direct observations you'll be able to make. And it's really just a game changer, I think. So I notice long, skinny things again. I notice uneven texture. I notice uneven pattern. I notice pokey looking things. I also notice all this weird pink stuff in the background and this big sort of like white, smooth, weird thing. I notice, yeah, those are the two major color differences. And there's a really bright light coming from the background. I notice a little bit of yellow. Those would all be perfect examples. So now let's take a minute and write down things that you wonder about it. What are some things that you wonder about it? You can wonder things like, I wonder what it feels like. Is it an animal? What are some of those one-word questions that we talked about before? Age, species, gender. Just because, and I'm going to give it away now, just because it's a lizard or a reptile doesn't make it a he. I've noticed that almost all English speakers in the area where I live automatically refer to lizards, snakes, and stinging insects as he automatically and referring to them instead of using, some people use it, but mostly people will say he. which is very interesting. For example, in Spanish, which has genders for pretty much everything, lizards are female, but in English, at least where I live, people automatically just think of them as he's, when in fact they could be females as well. And in fact, there are some lizard species where there are only females, no males. I will nature journal about them in the future, but let that sink in a little bit, in terms of, making assumptions when you're nature journaling or whatnot. Okay, great. So now that you did some questions, go ahead and write down some things it reminds you of. It reminds you of a lizard, reminds me of a dragon, reminds me of a lichen, a piece of lichen. That reminds me of someone's finger really close up in the background. It reminds me of a western fence lizard, and indeed, that is what it is. Okay, so we're going to move on to the next one. But first, I'm going to check in on the comments over here. Just see if anyone's posted anything. Okay, so okay, I'm going to talk about something here on this one. If you were to nature journal this, I was really lucky to nature journal some of the brood cicadas when I was visiting the East Coast this summer. And one thing I just want to point out in terms of your mindset. So in nature journaling, we do drawing, and drawing is something that a lot of us have like strong feelings about and whatnot. And you just saw how I sort of navigated through drawing the crab, and having several drawings that I was not very stoked with. In this case, it's important to understand that there's certain subjects that are going to be really hard to draw. If you try to draw this cicada wing with these droplets of water hanging on the underside of the translucent panes, not to mention the orange veins overlapping those panes, this is going to be super hard to draw. And if you spend 4 hours and do like a hyper realistic drawing, you could probably get it, especially if you're using like opaque media. But just saying, this might be a place where you notice, oh, okay, this is going to be really challenging to draw, and then set the bar lower for yourself, or come up with some strategies for cartoonizing it, like making it more abstracted or symbolic, or using words. Like you could totally do, I notice, I wonder, it reminds me of, and not try to draw this, or you could just draw the head. All right, this could also be similar, skulls. A lot of times, if they don't just look like a cartoon skull, people won't recognize it as a skull. So it can be really challenging for a lot of people, and they feel like they had a failure because it doesn't read as a skull. That's fine, but nature journaling skulls is really good. And just remember that if it doesn't look like what it's supposed to right away, that is just because the subject matter sometimes is hard. So let's take a moment and do an I notice, I wonder, it reminds me of here. Oh my gosh, I just noticed something I never noticed before. So go ahead and write down things that you notice. And remember, when you're doing this part, pretend like you don't know about plants, animals, anything like that. You can notice shapes. You can notice things about color. It's your direct visual perception. So go ahead and write some of those down next to the prompt. I notice. There's a couple tricks in this one. I notice the leaves are wet. I'm actually testing you. I notice that there's little purple things in a couple places. I notice a lot of green in the bottom right, and I notice a lot of blue in the top right. I notice a lot of these sort of round shapes. Um, I notice some shininess. So in this case, this is actually a plant that, so I'm just going to jump into like the assumptions now that we played that game long enough. So this is a plant that could look like it has dewdrops on it, similar to what we were looking at before. But in this case, it's crystals. They're like salty crystals that this plant exudes. This is a plant that grows in a really salty area. But now there's two nature things in here that are sort of hiding. Hopefully you've noticed some of them. And I just noticed something that I had not seen before because I hadn't looked at this picture so big before. But you might notice there are some blues that aren't in the top right corner. And there's a pattern there. There's also some oranges that aren't in other parts and a slightly different pattern than the rest. And there is a little butterfly in there. And there were several butterflies on this plant. But I'm also now noticing that there is a spider in this picture. There is a little spider probably waiting for things to come to these flowers to eat them. So that's something I had not noticed before. Now let's go ahead and write down some questions. What are things that you wonder? And if you need to dive in to a super nerdy, in-depth video about questions, check out my video towards a taxonomy of questions. And I talk about categories for questions. So let's go ahead and write down things that we wonder now. The most fun. What are some of those one-word questions? One-word questions are awesome. They're like 3-letter words with 2 X's in Scrabble, or an X and a U, or I don't know what. So since there are these sort of rather different subjects in this one, if I were to ask a one-word question, it could be more ambiguous. So try to beware of that and not be so sneaky in using your one-word questions that you sacrifice intelligibility. But so for example, if I were to write down a one-word question for this one that just says taste, um, what am I talking about? Am I talking about the spider, the butterfly, the plant, the sky? So in that case, maybe taste of plant or plant taste. But these short questions, few word questions, are really, really useful for your nature journaling when you get to I wonder. Now go ahead and write down some things it reminds you of. And then I'll share some of what it reminds me of. One could be like your best guess taxonomically of what things are. Best guess for species is a great, it reminds me of, or it reminds me of something else you've seen that's similar to this. That's even better. And then the other category of it reminds me of would be something silly that it reminds you of. So usually like a food item, does it remind you of any food items? That can often be silly, a silly association. And that helps with your memory, making those silly associations. It reminds me of some kind of candy that I can't. There's like a candy where they like roll it in sugar. It's like a chewy candy or something, but then they like roll it in sugar or roll it in some kind of flavor crystals, and it looks kind of like that. But I'll just write candy down there. All right, cool. Now we're going to go to our next And perhaps final, I notice, I wonder, it reminds me of before I give some announcements. So let's go back to. All right. So I see some comments here. Hi, Annette. Thanks for joining in. All right. So, oops, that's not the view that I want. Okay, great. So we're going to do one more. I notice, I wonder, it reminds me of. Here is my page so far. And you can see, even just from doing some really easy, I notice, I wonder, it reminds me of, with found objects and photos, you can get a nature journal page going and start filling out some stuff. So now I'm going to choose another one that I'm really excited to look at together. And I'll just pick it from back here. Ta-da! We're going to look at this and do an I notice, I wonder, it reminds me of. So I'll switch to my document camera now, and we're going to start off, as usual, pretending like we don't even know what this is. We don't know about plants. We don't know about animals. We don't know about any of that stuff. But we do know about shapes, numbers, patterns, things like that. Colors. So go ahead and write down some things that you notice. So heterogeneity and homogeneity are really good ones. They're really direct observations of patterns and distribution. So for example, like I noticed that over here, it looks different than it looks over here. I noticed there's right through here, there's like a white line. And then there's a purple line here that's kind of rounded. And then there's another skinnier purple line. Then I noticed all these brown things kind of all lined up. And then over here, this pattern is just different and sort of bigger and pointier here. And then some things are pointing that way. It looks like it has radial symmetry. It might have bilateral symmetry. It looks like it has bilateral symmetry from this side and radial symmetry from this side. Oh, it almost looks like these purple hairy things are coming out in some sort of spiral pattern. Oh, I noticed that it's really dark in the middle. These are all things that you can notice. So if I were to say something like, I noticed that it has pollen on it, that's probably what that white stuff is, but that's different from a direct observation. So what is the direct information that your visual system is picking up that tells you that that might be pollen? You could also say, I noticed that it is dry. You don't notice that something is dry unless you have a sensory organ that measures humidity. And I don't think your eyes can do that. Maybe some other parts of your body can do that, but not your eyes, I don't think. So you are interpreting some kind of visual information to indicate dryness. Great. So let's go ahead and write down now some things that we wonder about it. Let's take a little bit more time with this one this time. What are some questions you have about this thing? Slightly different from the one we did look at, something like this, similar to this once before. All right, hopefully you use some of those one-word questions, and then go ahead and just write down something it reminds you of. It could even remind you of something from earlier today, perhaps. All right, great. Well, thanks for practicing nature journaling with me today. And it's definitely good to practice actually nature journaling when you're watching videos. So I know that I can be online consuming content just like everybody else. And I feel way better when I'm actually engaging with that and creating some of my own content at the same time. So, for example, while you're watching a nature journaling video or someone teaching you something, you can be sketching what they're doing, or you could be taking little a mixture of notes and drawings, like sketchnoting, so you can nature journal that. I was going to make today's episode about this index and how I make indexes for my nature journals, because right now I have 3 filled nature journals that I haven't gotten around to adding indexes to. But I decided just doing I Notice, I Wonder, It Reminds Me Of would be more fun for everybody else. I also plan on doing a video at some point in the future about more techniques from like flower pressing and sort of junk journaling and scrapbooking. So if you know anything about junk journals or scrapbooks or pressed flowers and you're doing stuff like that mixed into your nature journal or other journals and sketchbooks, let me know, because I'd love to do a future episode about that. And then I just also wanted to say that the landscape painting class that I'm supposed to be teaching with David Lucas on Sunday is going to get moved all the way until November, because there's a very large wildfire very close to his house. And it just doesn't seem like it's good to start preparing this course when he could get evacuated at any moment. So he is safe right now, but that course has been moved all the way until November 7th. If you paid for tickets already, you're good to go. You can also refund if that date doesn't work for you. Also wanted to say that since indexing can be so fun, I'm going to talk to Ivea about potentially doing some indexing during Pencil Miles and Chill. That could be a good place for people to practice how to use indexes. The other thing is I'm super, super excited for the interview coming up on Wednesday. Wednesday's episode of the Nature Journal Show, I'm going to be talking about Liz Clayton Fuller. If you don't know her stuff already, definitely go check her out. I don't think I have any links to her stuff with me right now. But I think if you just look up Liz Clayton Fuller, you'll be able to find her pretty much everywhere. On Instagram at least. And I think she has some stuff on her Facebook, but she also has a website, and she does amazing bird illustrations, really beautiful art. And she's the one that has been teaching with Cornell Lab of Ornithology. And I'm interviewing her on Wednesday. So if you have any questions that you want me to ask her, post them in the comments down below, or show up for that video when it comes out really soon. I think I can actually post the link here real quick. So you can go on over, or it will often be when you visit my YouTube channel, you should be able to see my upcoming videos when you are there. But let me just post this link in the chat here for people who want to come check out that show. Posted it there in the chat so people can see that and click on it, I think. But that's going to be an awesome conversation. I'm really, really looking forward to that. And then I have 2 other things that I've been meaning to announce for a long time. But super big thank you to Angie for sending me this 2 really cool fountain pens. She heard me talking about my Fude de Manin and some of the issues that I had with that, about it spilling and being hard to refill. But these are TWSBI pens, and they're really cool. I like a lot of things about the design, and the way that you refill them is really ingenious, because you just, how does this go? You just take the this sort of plastic case off of the pen, and it has this built-in spring and converter. So it's a plunger, and you can just stick this into the ink and suck it up really easily. And there's only one piece, in addition to the lid. I guess the lid goes down there. There's only one piece that needs to come off while you're doing that. Super convenient. This is the broad nib that she gave me to try out, and I've been experimenting with it. It is really fun. The other really cool nature journaling tool that someone sent me, also another one of my Patreon patrons, was Beth Ann from Australia. You probably know her from the Journaling with Nature podcast. If you don't, go check out Journaling with Nature. podcast. And this is a tiny microscope. So it has built-in lights here. And it's a tiny microscope that is, I think it's 60x. So teeny little microscope that you could put in your nature journaling kit. Beth Ann gave this to me. So really appreciate both of them. They are patrons on my Patreon as well as sending me nice stuff. Okay, thanks everybody for joining in, whether you were here live or you're watching the recorded version. I hope you got a little bit of more pencil miles today and filled a little page with some nature journaling. That's the important thing, is just little consistent contributions to your journal, and you're just going to keep getting better and have more fun and learn more. All right, everybody, have a good rest of your weekend. Bye. See you on Wednesday.